This is my first time giving a talk to an audience like this. I guess the first time at a conference. So I wasn't sure if I wanted no one to show up or the room to be packed. This seems like a good happy medium. I'm feeling pretty good about this. In like 2 minutes, if we could lock the doors and just prevent anybody else from coming in, that would be good. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about building open source centric companies and why you want to. Traditional slideshow theory tells me I should talk about who I am first, but I'm going to first start by making sure that we have all the right people in the room here. I want to set the right expectations. So I'm going to start with the tagline, which is why you would want to do this. I'm giving this talk, so I clearly have a lot to say, and I think it's the right idea. But I'm going to start with a little clip and let somebody a bit smarter than I explain it.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing, and it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard. And you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, if you're not having fun doing it and you don't really love it, you're going to give up. And that's what happens to most people, actually. If you really look at the ones that ended up being successful, unquote, in the eyes of society and the ones that didn't, oftentimes it's the ones that are successful loved what they did so they could persevere when it got really tough. And the ones that didn't love it quit because they're sane. Right? Who would want to put up with this stuff if you don't love it?
So that's my big why. If you want to do something successfully, you have to be passionate about it. Open source is thankfully something a lot of people can get passionate about. If you're here, my assumption is that you're the right people and you're included in that group. I'm going to focus a lot on during my talk on sustainability. A business's main goal is to stay alive over a long, sustained period of time, which again feeds back, means you need to be doing something that you're excited about and that you're passionate about, and more importantly, something that will get you through the hard times. You'll keep hearing this as a central theme, and as I say other things, kind of keep it in the back of your mind. So back to the beginning, who am I? Hi, I'm Leah. I'm the co-founder of a company called Tilde. We build open source software. We just released our first product, a Rails profiler called Skylight. Hopefully you stopped by the booth and met some of our people. In my opinion, I'm going to talk. So these are my companies and my main product that I'm affiliated with right now. But I also have spent a bunch of times over the last years working on all of the projects that you see listed here, among others. In my opinion, you need sort of a diverse group of people to run an open source project successfully, and that means not just coders. I'll talk a little bit more about it when I focus in on jQuery in a minute, but people often find it shocking to hear that I am on the core team of, for example, the Ember project. But there are a lot of different skill sets needed to actually make an open source project be successful in the world, and not shockingly, writing code is not the only one. People like to think sometimes, if I write it, they will come. There's a little bit more. And then there's also, if they do arrive, what do you do with them then? And how do you stop your servers from falling down, for example, which is like infrastructure, code related, but not working on the project, et cetera, et cetera. I tend to focus on areas of projects that are underserved. So for me, what that means is events, logistics, team infrastructure, like how do I build a core team that's really going to help this project advance and stay alive, evangelism. It's an important part of how I want to run companies, but certainly open source projects. These are the companies that I spent the last couple of years at, which when I was there, and hopefully still, I considered to be open source centric companies. They came together around a specific open source project, usually one that was particularly important to them and that their product and commercial success was invested in. I spent about 5 or 6 years on the board/core team of the jQuery Foundation, which is probably one of my more formative experiences. This is where I first learned the lesson about having core teams that were not only coders. It was an idea that originally came from John Resig, who I think did it before it crystallized in his head as a thing that he was doing. And then I sort of watched YahootCats take it from there and bring it to a number of these other projects and sort of make it reality. At jQuery, I mostly ran events. I ran like accounting for a while, which hopefully is the sort of thing that you don't need to worry about because like most projects don't get quite that big. But we had a guy named Yuri Bango who worked on evangelism and later ran a whole army of evangelists. We had people who specifically worked on the website, people who worked on infrastructure, et cetera. I probably don't really need to convince you about how successful jQuery was, but what I will say is when I started getting involved in it, Prototype was king master of all, and we were basically laughed out of the room. And we all know how that went. So Ember is my main open source project focus right now. It's the main open source project that Tilde is built around. It benefits a lot from the lessons that we learned at jQuery, at Merb, at all these projects over the years that got us to where we are. And hopefully, in like 3 years, I'll make that joke about prototype and jQuery, but it will be like Ember and something else, and we'll all be like, yeah, haha. It has a vibrant ecosystem. It has companies doing training, consulting, screencasts, now multiple conferences. It's a really, really long list. And it's healthy, so hopefully it's headed in the right direction. But before we go anywhere else, I want to talk about what I consider the so-called elephant in the room, which is the benefits. Like, I talked about why personally, but if you're here, you're sort of on board with that. You've got other stakeholders that you really need to keep happy. You've got VCs, you've got partners, you've got co-founders, and all these people who are sort of like, usually they're not going to be coders, actually, and so is probably where their hesitation comes from. It's kind of a tough sell. Do this free thing, and success will follow. So I'm going to talk about some of what I consider to be the low-hanging fruit, the sort of baseline arguments that you can reach for when you're trying to convince them that building an open-source-centric company and supporting your project is the right thing to do. So the first thing is expertise. If you're contributing to X project and your company is using that project to build your product, you obviously have the top-notch in-house expertise, the best you could get. Depending on how successful your open-source project gets, it typically means the sort of in-house expertise that you would otherwise be paying a lot of money to consultants and other experts outside later. Influence and access. If you're contributing to the project and you're using it, it seems like it would be nice to have influence over the future of the project. There's a lot of value in having a seat at the table when open source project core teams are having those conversations about what features to prioritize, which types of breaking changes are okay, which older versions they're going to support of what APIs, and that can really make or break your product, as I'm sure you all have had that experience, right? We use something, not enough other people use it, and we have no way to say, like, hey, we still need that, we need your help. Thankfully, open source projects at least are trying to be meritocracies in most cases. So if you're smart and you're contributing and doing work, you're going to have that opportunity to be in the room and say, like, hey, no, here's my argument for why. Let's do something that will be good for me as well. This is the easiest one to sell to the outside stakeholders. Recruiting, yay. Being involved in an open source project means that you have access to the top talent working on your technology, and they will want to come and work for you. It's a fast track to being able to hire people who otherwise probably would sort of be in the like, oh, I'd like to hire X person, but I wouldn't even dream of it, right? And sort of you position yourself in a place where it's like, no, that super famous influencer is somebody that I talk to online and IRC every day because we're both invested in the success of this specific project, and it becomes a lot easier to get these things accomplished. Lastly, it's a little bit related to recruiting, obviously, but building an approachable brand and reputation around open source is basically developer marketing gold. It builds a lot of goodwill. Certainly in the communities that I'm most involved in, which are Rails and JavaScript, people are conscious and aware and really very thankful to others who are building and ensuring the success of these open source projects that they get to use for free every day at their jobs. That means they like you, it means they want to buy whatever it is you're selling, and it means that they're going to want to help you however they can. One example of a company supporting open source that has achieved many of these benefits is AT&T. They hired my good friend, I'm sure all of your good friend as well, tender love Aaron Patterson, and even though it turns out that he spends some of his RailsConf keynotes making fun of them, it is still a really good strategy. It's really paid off for them. If you've watched who's filtered in and out of the AT&T interactive development team over the years, it's a pretty impressive list of open source luminaries. I point them out also specifically because they're very different from Tilde. And Tilde, my company, a small company, is the main sort of thing that I'm going to talk about throughout my talk. AT&T is basically this huge, like, behemoth organization, and they're supporting open source in a way that is probably negligible, if at all noticeable, on their bottom line, but in a way that can really make a world of a difference in people wanting to affiliate with them and support them and fill these jobs. Okay, so we've talked about why we want to go this route. We've got some people. We talked about how to get some people along the way. You're still sitting here. That's good. So let's talk about how you can make it happen. I know that the first thing a lot of people think about when they think about doing something like this is funding. The funny part for me is that when I first wrote this talk, the first couple of drafts didn't talk about it at all, and that's just because it's kind of the least interesting part to me. Finding the money to fund the fun stuff is like not my personal favorite creative outlet, but I know that it's a top concern for everybody. And I think that there are also, similarly, some low-hanging fruit sort of ways to make it happen. So that's what I'm going to focus on in the funding section. But first, I'm going to point out another common thread here, which is that you really want to be building a symbiotic relationship between your open source project and your funding sources. The ultimate goal is to have a relationship where the open source project is supporting the development of the product, and the product revenue is supporting the development of the open source project. Basecamp is one example of somebody who I think did this successfully. They used the development of Basecamp to push Rails forward. They used Rails to push Basecamp forward, and it helped them get to the place they are today, which is obviously super duper millionaires, but also they have a really, really great product, and they were able to have all the technology that they needed to get there along the way. I'm going to talk a little bit later about a nuanced thought on some of the ways that they did this. Like, I think they got it 90% of the way correct, but they definitely achieved that symbiotic relationship that kept both things going. So let's start by talking about the things that don't work. These are possibly the easiest things to grab onto and the first things that a lot of people think about, but they're my least favorite. So the first one is venture capital. An open source strategy is basically playing the long game. It needs time, it needs faith, it needs the sort of things that most VC arrangements will not give you enough runway to pull off. VCs understandably need quick wins, they need momentum, they need ROI where they can say, like, where did that $4 go into my bottom line? What did I get out of that event sponsorship, project sponsorship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very hard, near impossible, to actually pull that out of a strategy like this, which involves a lot of, I believe that this is going to work, and then 2, 3, 4 years down the line, it absolutely will. So it turns out to be a formula for a lot of frustration and probably a lot of failure. The next thing is donations. Things like GitTip, putting a PayPal donate link on your website. They're not bad, don't get me wrong. You should absolutely do them in addition to other things, but it's very, very hard and near impossible, I would say, to achieve the volume of revenue that you need to sustain a company and to build a product using things like this. Even with jQuery, which is huge and tremendous, we had for years just like donate buttons all on our website, and we actually spent time thinking about like where they should be positioned so that people actually saw them. And at our most successful, it amounted to maybe a couple $1,000s a month, which is not enough. We even did a couple of times where we did sort of donation drives. They took a lot of effort, were not really worth it, and then at the end, you sort of like, I don't know if that was the right idea. So I don't think it's going to help, but I also don't think it's going to hurt, so by all means, put it out there. It's a nice sort of little pat on the back from people sometimes. Selling support. So support is one of the obvious things that people think about. Oh, I have this open source project. How will I make money? I will get people to pay me to help them use it. It's really hard to make work on a small scale. I think it's working well for like a company like Red Hat, where they have these mass armies of engineers on call to do whatever it is you might need to do, but I'm not really focused on being that huge right now. I'm sort of focused on sustaining small to medium-sized businesses, maybe so you get there in the future, but not quite there. So a couple of specific points about why I think selling support is not good for a model like this. The first thing, attaching a price tag that is high enough to cover your expenses is the sort of price tag that makes people try to extract a lot more value out of the service than they can. You're sort of a smaller company, and so, okay, you're going to think about it. I need to charge X number of dollars per hour. It's going to need to be something that's not super low, that's high enough to like make it respectable and to pay your bills. And at that point, you get people sitting on the other side of the fence saying, like, that's a lot of money. I really need to squeeze every little bit out of it. And it sort of just creates a mismatch in value and delivery and price that doesn't work out very well. The second thing is that running a support infrastructure and system requires a lot of administrative overhead. You have the scheduling, you have the sales, you have the managing tickets and the tooling and who's on call and what shifts and all that. And it's rarely something that you can get to a scale to pay your bills without needing like lots of other people and expensive tools to make happen. The third thing is that it adds the emotional complexity of this urgent need. It's the sort of thing where like, oh, a ticket came in. We have X number of hours, minutes, seconds, whatever it is to get a response. And it sort of builds a level of stress that, from my perspective, you really want to reserve for building your product and whatever the main goal of your company is, right? Because that's going to happen too. We need to meet this deadline. We need to push this out for this event, whatever. And so you can't really have two things eating up that much of your emotional sanity. The fourth thing is that selling support really puts your revenue goals at odds with the goals of your open source project. If you need to make money paying people to help you with it, you are incentivized to make it difficult. You are not incentivized to make it as easy as possible. If you need to make money maybe gating certain features, you are not incentivized to make your project as good as it can be and scratch everybody's itches, because you're like, oh, well, that's something people really need. We should reserve that for our paid tier so that we can make money. So it's sort of like a weird dichotomy and the kind of place you don't want to be. Last on my list, it's just really, really hard to optimize. It's like you reserve a bucket of hours, but then you have to figure out what your people are doing when people are not using the full amount of hours, and that usually means sort of double selling in a way that's sane, but then you get 3 people who want the time at the same time, and it's just like bad news. So I'm not a fan. So now that I've naysayed a whole bunch of things, let's talk about the things that I like and the things that do work. You want to sort of float in and out of all of the areas that I'm going to talk about as the money ebbs and flows, as the demands of the market ebbs and flows, and as the demands of your product ebbs and flows. You sort of need to be like, okay, well, if I'm heads down on product, for this month, I need to be doing this sort of thing, which takes less time. Or if I'm going to be able to give 6 months to my open source project and not focus on my product, I might want to do X, Y, Z. So consulting. Consulting, similarly, one of the obvious things that people think about, certainly in our community, bootstrap via consulting. It has risks and rewards. The revenue from consulting is highly addictive. It's the highest sort of like, how many dollars am I going to make per hour in a consistent fashion kind of thing. But it does require you to leave your product for long periods of time, because usually you're taking on a 3-month project, a 6-month project, et cetera. And obviously you want to do a good job. You need to be all focused on that. So typically it's a good source of revenue that has some expense on the side of your product. You should definitely do some. And part of the reason why it's super important to do some is you want to make sure that you're doing consulting for people that are using your open source project. Not just anybody who will pay you to do anything, which sort of definitely widens the pool of people who you can get your money from. But if you're doing consulting for people using your open source project, it's really giving you a much broader perspective on your open source project, and thus an ability to have it be more successful. It's very easy when you're working on a product to sort of fall into the tunnel vision, pigeonhole, whatever, where it's just like, my need is X, and so the project is only going to go in the direction of X, and consulting can really help you make sure that you're considering the broader needs. The next thing is training. Ideally, you can slowly shift your revenue or portions of your revenue from consulting to training. It's good because you get these bursts of revenue without needing to take away time from your product, right? You can do 1 week, you can do 1 day, 3 days, whatever it is. You get it in there, you make all that money, and then you sort of go back to your product for a month or 2 or whatnot. Personally, I like the formula of smaller, high-priced groups where you charge a premium, you keep the group small, and they get highly individualized, really valuable attention from these experts that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, versus the other alternative is like you fill, say, a room like this and to capacity, and you sort of make it general, and people, maybe some of them will get out of it, some of them they won't. I think you probably want to mix. The former is kind of more fun. It really gets the project creators having more one-on-one experiences with people where they're, again, gaining insight into how people are thinking about their product, and specifically insight into how new people are dealing with the onboarding. We do training for Ember at Tilde, and every time that they come back from the intro class, they're like, I didn't realize that thing was super annoying, but it's really slowing down people and probably turning people away. So that's super valuable information. Events. Events scratch a couple of itches. The obvious one, it's in the funding section, but events are really a key part of scratching the itch, the need to build a community. Community is super important for sustaining the larger plan. If a community is invested in your technology and invested in your success, your whole company will be invested in your success. It's sort of an infectious, publicly visible, awesome thing that sort of keeps you going and gives you that push. It also makes you not want to let people down. It gets you sort of addicted to the goodwill of constantly being exposed to people whose lives are being influenced in a positive manner by what you're doing. And this community will really feed leads back into all the other things. The consulting, the training, whatever else it is that you're doing around your open source project, you're going to meet these people at the events, and they're going to want to buy more things from you and sustain your company. It's obviously also revenue. Conferences can make money. A lot of people, it's a challenge and it's hard, and a lot of people say, oh, conferences can't make money. They are not doing it well enough. Now, they're not necessarily always going to be like multi-million-dollar affairs, but at the very least, if you are conservative enough and you don't take super risks in terms of what kind of contracts and all those sorts of situations that you get yourself into, you should be breaking even, and ideally, you should be making money. There are 3 obvious sources of income under events, which is just sponsorships, admissions, and then affiliated workshops and trainings. I'd like for my events to sort of optimize a mix of all 3, at the very least 2 out of the 3. So I tried to make a point of repeating this over and over. Hopefully you've been noticing it as a thread. The common theme here is being sustainable. With something like VC, which I mentioned in the section of things you don't want to do, that is a much better way to crash and burn, for example. Or if you want to take the 18-month ride of your life and then go out of business, go that way. That sounds good. I'm focused more on the things that you can do to keep going and to persevere. So we talked about why you want to do it. We talked about some of the benefits and perks of doing it. We talked about a lot of the ways that you can fund it. Let's get into the fun part, which is why it's really, really hard. So the first thing is emotional ups and downs. As you achieve success with your open source project, people begin to rely on your software, and they really begin to want more and more and more from you. And you need to be really careful with setting these expectations. That's my first item on a list of things to keep in mind as it relates to your emotional state of well-being. People are going to hold you to these expectations that you set with them as you grow and as you go on. The second thing is you really need to be open to letting other people help, and more importantly, you need to not be afraid of letting other people help. There's sort of a desire to, as soon as you start an open source project and you achieve success, you sort of want to grab onto every possible offshoot of income that comes out of it. You want to be the guy doing the training, and you want to be the guy running the events, and the guy selling the consulting and all of that. In fact, what you really want to do is be building a community where other people can do a lot of that. If you are successful, you do not need to be threatened by this. There's enough money to go around, and you want to make sure that people are just not going to be just relying on you for all of it. So you need to get other companies and other experts involved. The third thing, track the successes. However you want to do that, be that a list on your desk or whatever it is, there will be hard times, and you're going to really need, during those hard times, to be able to go back to that list and say, this is why I'm doing this. Remember that time when we solved that person's problem. Remember that time when we felt really, really awesome. The fourth thing is that you want to meet people. We talked a little bit earlier about why community is important, but just as important is the fact that the internet is rarely a representative sample of how people are actually feeling. Specifically, the people who are pissed and grumpy are usually the loudest. And that can really, if all you're getting is the loud shouting from the couple of people who are not being very nice and thankful and really complaining, you're going to feel pretty crappy, and it's going to make it hard to go on. So you want to get out there. You want to meet people. Typically, when you come to an event, you will still get some of those people who are like, I'm kind of just here to be a jerk. But what you'll get a lot more of is, hey, I wanted to come out because I'm super excited by what you're doing, and you're really impacting my day-to-day life. On that same vein, stay above the fray. Try not to engage with those people. It's very easy when someone is attacking you to want to defend yourself, and there's surely a measure that you can do it, but sort of do it above the fray. Try and do it in an objective fashion. Try and argue, if you're going to get into arguments at all, on specific technical points, and not into the nasty he said, she said, I'm just kind of a grumpy person on the internet stuff. And they will try to lure you in. So just keep this in mind. Lastly, take time away. This is sort of a universal principle. You want to go away. You want to gain perspective. You want to recharge. Everything that you're doing is going to feel constantly urgent. That will probably never go away. So at some point, you just need to say, even though it feels right now like I can't possibly take time away, I'm going to take a step back. Whether that means check out another project or go on an actual vacation, whatever that means to you, sort of get your brain somewhere else so that you can come back with a renewed energy and renewed insights and keep going. The next challenge related to money is always a challenge, but how do you be frugal versus being cheap? Realize, like I said before, that most of the things that you're going to spend money on in a strategy like this are not going to translate directly to leads or sales or whatever your specific metric for success is. You need to make sure that everybody on your team realizes this ahead of time and will not be grumpy about it later. There's 3 areas that I like for making sound investments in this sort of strategy. The first one is sponsorships. The key here is to start small. You can get a lot of runway out of donating, say, $500 to some guy to fix some bug that's been really, really irritating people, or these sort of smaller opportunities. And I guess the point here is I'm not really talking about, like, go sponsor RailsConf at $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 or whatnot. When you're a small, medium-sized business, that's really a little bit out of your reach. And even if it's in your reach, possibly not the most responsible way to spend it financially. And you'll get a lot more out of just, like, parceling out the money in small ways to people where it'll be specifically meaningful to them, and you'll be able to point to the benefits of that investment that you made. Second thing is swag and branding opportunity. This is sort of a tough one. The big star that you don't see on there is not crap, right? Not everything that you can stick your logo on needs to have your logo on it. Not everything that you stick your logo on needs to exist. You want to focus on meaningful things that people will actually use or wear or share or whatnot. If you have doubts about an item, just say no. If you have doubts about an opportunity where, hey, pay me XYZ and I will just slap your logo on this or mention your name in this, if it doesn't seem like it's right, just say no. It's easy to find these sort of opportunities. You'll get 100 more of them. People are very good about letting you pay them to just say your name out loud. So be very choosy about what you do there. And then lastly, user groups, smaller events. When I talked about sponsorships, I specifically mentioned like doing things like fixing code and whatnot. But user groups are a really good way, similarly, where you can spend $200 or $300 just sending pizza to a meetup while people hear about XYZ. And it's the sort of thing where it's not like, here's my logo in your face, right? And it's the sort of thing where people are really appreciative, especially if you can go so far as to spend like $400 instead of $300 and get them like a healthy sandwich or something versus like the same pizza that they get every month, right? These are ways to throw in a little bit more money and earn a lot more goodwill. I don't have a sub-list for this one. Avoid being the evil corporate overlord. If you think it makes you look like Dr. Evil, if you think it makes you look like Sun or Darth Vader, don't do it. Just say no. In all of the things that I talked about doing to make money, it's really important that you step with a light foot. You have to sort of keep in mind, if I provide value, then people will want to help support me rather than what can I do to shove my logo in their face. If you have a speaking opportunity, I highly recommend speaking about your open source project. You should mention along the way, of course, that also we sell XYZ thing, but get the people in the room for something that will actually serve them and something that's a little bit magnanimous, and then at the end of it, they will want to help you and they will want to support your profit-making project or whatever it is. Survive while you're gone. What I mean is you need to be sure that your project is not going to fall down when you are away working on your product or other company interests. You need to build your community so that other people can take lead roles. You're building leaders, not just community. Again, this is scary from a revenue perspective because it does mean that some of these people are also going to try and extract funding out of your community. And by funding, I mean sell them support, sell them training, sell them this, sell them that. It's not scary. It's a good sign. And in the long run, it's the healthiest thing for you if you're going to be able to take a step back and work on your product. This feeds right into number 2, give up that control. Helping develop leaders who don't work for your company means giving it up, but it also means that you have a much broader perspective on the team building your project. It means that there are going to be people there who are going to help you build the project in a way that you couldn't have done all on your own. I always advocate the benevolent dictator method of running an open source project rather than I am king, do as I say. And similarly, it can be scary, but find people that you trust, find people who are willing to put just as much work into it as you can, and help build them up, and then give them some actual control and ability to influence things. Putting too much you into it. All my things, my talk is very symbiotic. Each thing is sort of intertwined with the other. It's very, very easy to make your project be the tool that serves your needs at the company. It's very easy to do that and not actually include the needs of other people. This is one of the things that I mentioned earlier about DHH and Basecamp. I think they stepped a little heavier than I would advocate for something like this. And in the Parley letter, which some of you have read, it's like a blog post that DHH did, he basically said Basecamp equals Rails, Rails equals Basecamp. And that was kind of a turnoff for a lot of people. And at different points in different features being added to Rails, it was a turnoff where people were like, this doesn't actually serve a majority of the people who use this framework. And the answer was, oh, well, but it serves Basecamp. Now, the project is big enough that I think a lot of those things ended up getting corrected in the long term. But it's important that you make sure that your project stays general purpose and stays the sort of thing that other people are going to want to use and are going to be able to use, and not just a tool, a vehicle for the building of your personal project. Last reminder here, you want to create an environment where your open source project and your product enjoy a symbiotic relationship where they feed into each other and they rely on each other for success. So let's wrap up some of the top level points, and then I'll let you guys go. Number 1, the goal is happiness and sustainability. Number 2, having in-house open source expertise and access to top talent for hiring, for learning from. It's really good for your company. It's really good for your product. It's good for marketing. In the long haul, it's really advantageous. Number 3, you want to get your funding from diverse sources. This is going to protect you from tunnel vision. It's going to allow you to learn the most about what your users need. A little asterisk. I talked earlier about some funding sources that were kind of bursty, like training. You want to be careful with things like that at the very beginning of your company, which is to say, make sure that you don't rely too heavily on big burst sources of funding, because too early, failing is too costly. If you put all your resources into selling, say, a training, and then it doesn't sell out, and it's the very beginning of your company, something like that could actually put you out of business. So your funding sources should be diverse, they should be responsible, and they should come up in the right stages of the demand and the project lifecycle. 4, make sure your open source software project goals and the product goals for your company are not at odds. They should feed into each other. Again, this is one of the major reasons why I thought a support model was not the right way to do this. 5, lastly, think about sustainability. I focused a lot today on things that I think you should be able to sustain over a medium to long duration of time. Building an open source centric company is a long, hard road. The goal is not to make it from point A to point B as fast as possible. It's really to get from A to Z and still be alive and solvent and happy. Thank you.